All right, Brandie, go ahead.
Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Brandie Waite and I am a Genesee County Master Gardener. So today we're going to talk about cool flowers. And first of all, what are they? I mean, yes, they're cool, like they're awesome to grow, but they are actually hardy annuals. And so a hardy annual is described as plants that live for 1 year, and they don't just survive the cold weather, they actually thrive in cooler temperatures. So many cool flowers can be planted in the fall. They overwinter as immature plants, and this allows them to establish an incredibly strong root system. So in the spring, they get a jump start on the season, and they produce some of the earliest blooms. So sometimes people have trouble with this, this crop of flowers, hardy annuals. They can be hard to get started. And I think it's because in a lot of gardens, especially here in Western New York, spring comes on pretty quickly and it doesn't hang around long. Like we go right from winter to summer, it seems a lot of times. And so it's hard to accommodate our natural gardening instinct. You know, we're used to planting tender annuals, and so the weather gets warm when summer comes and we plant our tender annuals and they bloom all through the summer. And a lot of times it's hard to transition that over to the spring. We try to get out there as early as we can, but a lot of times that window of opportunity has already passed. So if we figure out the timing of this group of flowers, it's on a different timing calendar. And once you get that figured out, it really makes the process a lot easier. Oh, there we go. Okay, so cool flowers, they're not new by any means. They've been around a long time. This is a picture from the Better Homes and Gardens new garden book. The copyright was 1961, and it's annuals, winter flowering, or for cool growing season. So it's actually a rekindled concept. The timing has been rediscovered. And I think because, several decades ago, almost every home had a vegetable garden, and in that vegetable garden you typically had some flowers, and depending on how much time you spent in the garden, you were more in tune with when things were self-sowing and naturally germinating, and people just had more sense of the concept. And as time went on, that technique just got lost. So the confusion with hardy annuals versus tender annuals comes in because their life cycle doesn't fit what we think of when we think of an annual. They actually, for a lot of them, they begin their life cycle as a seed in the fall. And depending on if the plant is winter hardy, it'll germinate in the fall and overwinter, or if it's not, the seed will just lay dormant and make it through the winter and then germinate in the spring when the conditions are right. So it's just figuring out that timing. So why grow them? Well, you get the earliest spring blooms, and who doesn't love that nice pop of color first thing in the spring? They're also really beneficial to our native pollinators. It provides a lot of early food for them. I personally wanted to grow cool flowers because I'm a cut flower grower, and I really wanted to fill that gap. There's always a gap in the garden between like mid-May and early June. The tulips are done, but the summer annuals haven't started blooming yet. So I discovered this process and I figured, you know what, I'm going to give it a try. And last year I planted some things in the fall and I had really good luck this year. So I'm going to start with my resources, just so you guys have a sense of where I'm coming from. And if you do have to get off early, you know where to go to for this information. So the book Cool Flowers, I do have a copy here if anyone wants to take a look. It is by a gardener and cut flower grower, Lisa Mason Ziegler. She is down in Newport News, Virginia, and she has been growing cut flowers for, I think, 25 years. So she is a seasoned grower. And in this book, she profiles 30 of her favorite cool flowers. And she goes over planting, when to plant, if it's if you should direct sow or if you should start indoors, if any are deer resistant, will they self sow in the garden? She does spacing for garden planting as well as cut flower planting. This process can be enjoyed in a landscape bed just as much as it can be by cut flower growers. And so if you purchase the book, unfortunately, our libraries do not have the book right now. If you purchase the book, it's about $25, $28. It comes with a free virtual book study. So, as you're reading the book along, you can access the virtual book study, and it's actually videos of her speaking and talking through each chapter. So it just kind of helps reiterate the process. If you don't want to make the investment right now, on her website, it's thegardenersworkshop.com. She has several free resources available, so you can kind of check it out and see if you like her style. One series is called the Cool Season Flower Chronicles, and she outlines some of the varieties in the book. And then if you wanted to take it to a more commercial level, she has an online course called Cool Flowers Beyond the Book for Flower Farming. Just takes it a bit further if you want to grow for production. Okay, so planting options. There are two types of planting methods for cool flowers. You either sow the seeds directly into the garden, or you start the seeds indoors and transplant them into the garden. For direct seeding, you can do it either in the early spring or the fall. And it just depends on the plant and the plant's life cycle. When does it want to be sown, in the spring or the fall? And does it like to be direct sown? There's just some plants that they don't like to be transplanted. I think bells of Ireland and bachelor buttons, poppies, they are better if you just direct seed them right into the garden. And then the second method is to start the seed indoors and then transplant it into the garden. And the method is the same. You could do it in the spring or the fall. However, in Western New York, fall is probably the preferred method. Lisa, again, she's in Virginia, so not all of her experience translates over to us in the North, but she does want everyone to be successful with the method. So I would follow her because she does highlight how people do it in the North too, and how they are successful. I know that some people have transplanted in the spring. I just question the hardening off process. How do you do that so early? So that's something I need to research more. So I fall transplanted this year. When you're transplanting in the fall, you can also mulch to reduce weed pressure, and it gives the roots a little bit more insulation for the winter too. So whether or not you're planting in the fall or the early spring, you should have your bed, prepared and ready ahead of time, especially in the spring. Get it ready in the fall, let it go through the winter, and then it's ready for early spring. Okay, so the planting times. This is where it becomes really helpful to understand the timing if you actually put these dates on a calendar or you visually see them, because it doesn't make sense to what we're used to about starting our annuals, for summer. So fall planting, you would plant the transplants out, or you would direct sow the seeds 6 to 8 weeks before your first frost date. If you were going to do an early spring planting, you would transplant or direct sow the seeds 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. So I broke it down. Genesee County can be a hardiness zone of 5B to 6A, depending on where you are. And our approximate first frost date is around October 10th. I feel like the past few years it's been much later. But if you wanted to have a fail-safe date, I would go with maybe around October 10th. You could go a week, later or so. So that would mean your fall plant date would be August 22nd. That would be 7 weeks back. So if you're going to direct sow seeds in the fall, you can direct sow them on August 22nd. But if you were going to do transplants, you would have to go back another however many 4, 6 weeks, whatever it says on the seed packet from August 22nd and start those seeds. So we're right on the cusp of, you know, if you wanted to do transplants, do them this week. get them started indoors this week. And then the same thing with the spring. Our last frost date is approximately May 20th. So your spring planting date, if you were going to direct sow into the garden, would be around April 1st. That's a 7-week date. So again, you can go back a week, forward a week. And then if you were going to start transplants, if you wanted to transplant them out on April 1st, you would have to go back another 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the seed starting dates on the back of the package. Lisa Mason Ziegler, she uses a lot of row cover, like just the very light agribon. So she uses it both in the fall and the spring. When she transplants or even direct sows, she'll put that over top of it. She typically uses the little wire hoops. It protects from wind, wind damage, deer and rabbits. However, we are not in Virginia, and she takes them down in Virginia. If they're going to get some snow, she'll take the hoops down and let it be, but we just get too much snow up here. The wind is too rough. I have not bothered with the row cover on any of my plantings, but if you really, want to try a spring planting, a spring transplant, you would probably benefit from putting some row cover over it. Okay, so there's 30 plants to try in the book. We just don't have time today to go through all of them, but I wanted to give you an idea of some of them. This is basically, it mimics the chart that she has. She profiles each plant individually in her book, and then she has a chart in the back that looks similar to this. So it tells you the botanical name, the common name, the winter hardiness zone, and the Lisa's preferred seed starting method. So some of the common ones are bupleurum. That is a really great foliage for cut flowers. It's really good in the garden too. It has a nice textural element, but it does best direct sown into the garden, and you would seed it in early spring. Bachelor buttons, they're another one that you can sow outdoors right into the garden in early spring. I've had some success with that, and I think that they might overwinter. I noticed some last fall, like closer to the foundation of the house, that they were little baby plants in the fall, and I think that they can make it through and then bloom earlier in the spring. So that would be an interesting one to try, to maybe get it to germinate in the fall, and see if it would overwinter.
Which one is it?
The bachelor buttons. So Daucus is False Queen Anne's lace. This one, it will self-sow in the garden. I don't think the plants are necessarily winter hardy, but it will drop seed, and I think the seed overwinters, and then it will germinate, first thing in the spring when the conditions are right. Larkspur is another one that will germinate in the fall. It'll overwinter and continue growing in the spring. Or if you wanted to sow it, you could sow it early in the spring, direct seed it into the garden. Sweet William is one that you can try. That one, I don't know if I would fall plant it and overwinter it. That's one that I want to experiment with in the future. Nigella, gardeners probably know more about this one. I've never tried to grow it. I'm assuming it'll self-sow and come up on its own. Yeah.
If it likes your soil, it'll help.
Yeah. And then poppies. So heirloom poppies, they're not necessarily grown for cut flowers. The blooms are beautiful. The pollinators love them, but the flowers only last a couple days. But you can use the pods in arrangements, and they are really great. So those you direct sow outdoors in the early spring. So a few other ones to try. Not only just hardy annuals, but some perennials, short-lived perennials and biennials, they work better as hardy annuals or planted as a cool flower. So say foxglove, for example. So foxglove, if you do a non-hybrid, like an heirloom variety, it's technically a biennial. So the package will probably tell you, okay, you're going to sow this seed in early spring. It's going to live through the summer. it's going to overwinter, and it's going to bloom the following spring. But why not just plant it in late summer? Why not start it indoors in mid to late summer, transplant it in late summer, early fall, and let it go through the winter that way, instead of it trying to fight through the humid August weather and disease and bugs and all of that. I feel like it might be healthier if you did the cool flower method with it. Feverfew, that's typically a short-lived perennial in the garden. It blooms great the first year. It might peter out. It might come back. As a cut flower grower, I want to guarantee that I have quality flowers. So I don't want to take a risk of not having it. So I'm willing to plant it every year so that I have those quality blooms. The same thing with yarrow. I'm sure some of you are like, no, why would you ever start yarrow? But they make these really beautiful hybrid colors, and they typically peter out, or they'll revert back to the native color, and they won't keep the fancy color. So you can just treat them as an annual, especially if you want to use them in bouquets, and start them every year. The same thing with rudbeckias. They make some really fancy hybrids, and they might peter out the second year and do nothing. So if you want to guarantee you're going to have them, you can start them in the midsummer, transplant them out early fall, and have them in the spring. Okay, so let's talk about my experience with cool flowers. So I wanted to try this, and I wanted to document it so I could prove to you all that it works. And I started from seed and fall planted feverfew, rudbeckia, and yarrow. And then this spring I direct sowed giant poppies. They were an heirloom poppy, Hungarian blue, and I had some surprises, some bupleurum, and I always have larkspur. It just really likes my garden. So let's go through each of these. So feverfew is the first, and I started it from seed on 8/15, which is really late. That's when I should have been, technically probably transplanting it in the garden last year. But I like to use the soil blocking method. I started all of these with soil blocking. It takes like 3 weeks off of your growing time. Like you can transplant a lot sooner with soil blocks. So I could have got them planted a lot sooner than October 14th. But I did not. So I didn't get them in the ground until October 14th, which is, later than what it should have been. I planted both in raised beds and in the ground. I did 9x9 spacing. They did really well in both areas. The rabbits did not eat them outside of the fence for the most part. The ones that were in the ground outside of the fence, I did lose probably half of them, mainly because they were too small, I think, at time of transplant. They got browsed on a little bit by wildlife, and then I think they just didn't make it through the winter. They were on the west end of the garden and really got that winter wind. But as you can see, so this is what they looked like in the fall when I planted them. Not bad, like 3-inch seedling. And then in April, I mean, they were looking good. They were nice. They were green. By May, they were doing really well, and I had my first blooms around June 14th. So I think that that's pretty good. I wanted to give you two. So production wise, I had approximately 24 plants, and I harvested about 138 stems. So say about 6 stems per plant. So that's, I think, pretty good. I'm definitely going to start some feverfew this weekend and try to get it in a little bit sooner.
What variety did you plant?
This one was Tetra White.
That's what I tried to get.
Yeah. Yeah. Johnny's has it right now. Yeah. And then I wanted to get I think Virgo, but I think I didn't want to pay the price. I think it was too expensive. So the only thing is with feverfew, if you are growing it for cut flowers, next year I probably would add netting. The ones in the raised beds, they did stay pretty upright, but the ones that were in the ground and got more wind, some of the stems did flop, and then they're too hard to use in bouquets that way. So rudbeckia, in 2020, I tried the variety Cherokee Sunset, and I started it like you would like your normal, summer annuals. I started it in early spring inside and hardened it off and got it transplanted in late May, and it didn't bloom until August. So that's okay. That's nice that I had time to cut it, but I really need something earlier. So Lisa recommends Prairie Sun variety. She said it's the first rudbeckia to bloom for her. So I started the seeds indoors again, August 15th, really when I should have been transplanting them. I didn't get them. I got them in the ground before the feverfew on October 8th, but again, they were super small. Like, look how tiny they were. And I did raised bed plantings and a few in the ground. This is how they looked in April. They were looking really sad. Like, I didn't think that they were going to live. Like, I thought they were toast. But look at May, they came around, they rallied, and they were blooming by the end of June. So I think if I would have put them in sooner at the appropriate planting time of August, 20th, they would have maybe bloomed earlier. So outside of the fence, the rabbits ate them all. They just decimated them. There's a few that survived that are blooming now on like 4-inch stems. So they need protection from rabbits. The ones that were in the raised beds, they did wonderful. They are pretty drought tolerant too. Like, I do have some drip irrigation in here, but I didn't get it really installed until early June. And the only thing is, in the raised bed, because it does get dry, some of them did blow over a little bit more. I have some back here in the ground inside the fence, and those ones were really sturdy. They had a really nice root structure. So I don't think if they're in the ground, they would need any netting or support. So production wise on the rudbeckia, I would say I had about 23 plants. And I harvested about 180 stems, so about 7 stems per plant. And if you keep them deadheaded, they will send up a second flush. It's just a little bit shorter than the first. I tried to remember, and I don't think I pinched them. I think I just left them because I wanted the earliest bloom time as possible. The other thing I would recommend, like, if you're going to start and you want to grow and you want to have a solid block, like a section of 9x9 plantings, I would plant a little extra somewhere else. Like I had 3 raised beds planted, but the one raised bed, it just it was so hit or miss. Only a few made it because they were so small, but I took those transplants and I filled in these 2 beds and they transplanted over just fine. They filled in beautifully. So I would recommend starting maybe a few extra or growing a few extra to fill in if you have gaps. Okay, yarrow. So yarrow, I did the summer pastels variety. Same thing. I did it in soil blocks on August 15th. I got them in on October 14th. I forgot to take a picture of what they looked like in the fall, but they were pretty small. Like, they only had a few sets of leaves. They were even a little, I would say probably a little smaller than this April picture, but they did great. I did them both in the raised beds and in the ground. I lost more on that west end of the garden where I lost some of the feverfew, but what did survive down there, I used to fill in the 1 or 2 that were missing in the raised beds and the few that were missing in the ground on the east end. They're super drought tolerant. This is the east end of the garden. It's in the ground. It wasn't mulched, and I didn't water it at all. And this is what they looked like in July. So they're very drought tolerant. I would highly recommend them for even in your landscape bed. They attract so many beneficial insects to the garden. They're always like hoverflies and assassin bugs. Like, they just have a lot of activity around them. Production wise, I think I had around 34 plants. And I got well over 200 stems. So they are definitely worth it. I still left some in this bed that I just, I didn't really care for the color. So there were a few that I just didn't even cut. And I don't think they need netting either. They were pretty sturdy. And the rabbits leave them alone. They don't eat them. Okay, poppies. So I grew Hungarian blue. It's an heirloom bread seed poppy. And again, I did not grow it for a cut flower, but I grew it for the pods. And I direct seeded it into the garden. I think it was around mid-April. I've been trying to be better about writing down the dates of when I do things, but I forgot to write it down. But I do know that I just sprinkled it like willy-nilly in the garden, and I wouldn't do that again because it just like, it was kind of messy trying to thin them out. I would make a furrow, make a row, and you can plant them 9 by 9. And I would try to do them in the rows so that I could thin them appropriately. I would get a better crop that way. So they did beautiful. I harvested a few to put in arrangements, and then I let the rest go to seed because it is an heirloom. You can save the seed, and I built up my seed stock, and hopefully I will have double the amount next year. And then you can just let a few pods go. If you let the pods go, it'll self-sow in the garden and hopefully come up in that same spot next year. So like the seeds started to dry in the pods, I would say about 2 weeks ago. And so you just go up and you rattle it, you hear them shaking there, and then I just cut it off and put it in a paper bag. Okay, bupleurum. So bupleurum is, it's grown for a filler in arrangements, and I wanted to test it out in 2020. I direct seeded some in a little plot inside my garden, fenced area, and it did okay. I was happy with it, but it's a one cut. Like you only get like one cut from it and then it's done. You have to succession plant it if you want to use it in bouquets and have enough. So I trialed it and I was like, yeah, if I had a bigger garden, I would do more, but I obviously let some go to seed because in April, I noticed these little sprouts coming up and they have kind of gnarly foliage. It's like leathery almost. And I was like, oh my gosh, I think that's bupleurum. So I let it go. And by June 15th, it was blooming. And so this one is open pollinated, so you can save the seed. It started to go to seed, over the past couple weeks. So I harvested a bunch of the seed and I sprinkled it in a raised bed, and I'm going to try to keep the raised bed weeded and see if it will germinate in the spring next year. So hopefully I'll have a full bed of bupleurum. Larkspur. Larkspur is, I think it's hit or miss on your soil. I planted it in 2019 in the early spring. I direct sowed it and I've had it ever since. It is happy at my house. This time of year, the seed is dry. You can hear it rattling. So I'll just cut off a bunch of plants and I'll just sprinkle the seed where I want it to grow in my garden, and it actually germinates in the fall. So I took these pictures in November, and I always call them the little Dr. Seuss plants because they have that weird, foliage. And so you'll see it, you should see it in the fall. It should germinate and then overwinter, but you can direct seed it in the early spring. I think you just have to make sure you get the timing right. So I would either try to sprinkle some seed now, that's when it's naturally occurring, or you could try it in the early spring. And from this little tiny plot of larkspur, I harvested 40 stems, and I left a bunch because it looks beautiful in the garden. The bumblebees love it. The carpenter bees love it. Hummingbird. Oh yeah, the hummingbirds. And B, because larkspur is a total pain in the butt to harvest. You have to catch it at just the right time. And so it's beautiful. And sometimes I'm like, you know what? You're just more pretty to look at. So here you go. And the other thing with larkspur too, it's open pollinated, so you can save the seed. But if you want that fancy, you want that fancy double, buy the seed and seed it every year, because then you're going to get that fancy variety. Okay, so my first cool harvest flower of 2022 was bupleurum, feverfew, larkspur, a couple poppy pods, and some yarrow on June 14th. And I was thrilled. So I think if I get that rudbeckia in, I got to start those seeds right now. I have some at home and I got to get it ready and get it transplanted. And I think that it will work out. So from just those plants that I just went through, I produced about 50 cool flower bouquets from June to July. So I was pretty happy. And this was when the rudbeckia finally did hit. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah. Well, in the raised beds, it's Mel's mix. And then I try to add compost every year, but it does dry out a lot in the raised beds, a lot. And then my soil in the ground is like clay loam. But in some of the areas where I consistently garden, I haven't added compost this year, but I do try to add compost and amend the soil that way.
Do you use mulch?
So some of these, we had a really beautiful fall last fall, and we have a honey locust, and they dropped all its leaves in the driveway, and it was so nice and dry. I did mulch some of the beds with honey locust leaves because they're just the perfect size, but a lot of it blew off in the winter, and no, I typically don't mulch.
Brandie, what do you do in your spare time?
I sleep. Work, garden, eat, sleep.
Repeat.
Yes.
If anyone on the Zoom has a question, you can unmute or put it in the chat.
Catherine?
Okay, so do you save seeds like feverfew or just one?
The feverfew I didn't save. I would have to look up and see if it's a hybrid. I'm not. Prairie Sun is a hybrid. The feverfew Tetra White is probably a hybrid because it's a double. It's like it's a double feverfew. So that one I don't save. I typically, yeah, the bupleurum I saved once I realized that it was open pollinated and it would be, you know, it would be okay and come back true. The larkspur, I mainly do that for, you know, I usually don't grow larkspur for cuts. I just like it visually in the garden. So that I sprinkle the seeds. I don't save it through the winter. I just take it now and put it where I want it.
I think I read your chart correctly earlier on. You showed zone 5 about everything.
Yeah, so I tried to pick so Lisa's book, she goes through a bunch of different cool flowers, and so hers go all the way from like snapdragons could be 4, some varieties, all the way to, she has a few things that are 8, like lisianthus. So she can spring plant lisianthus, which I just don't think we can do here. It's too cold. But snapdragons, like, I don't think I would fall plant them. I don't think that they would make it through the winter, but I think that we could spring plant them. I think you could start them early, you know, late winter, and then get them transplanted in the early spring. I think, you know, they would be okay because they're cold tolerant.
I think I would try to find some in the fall. I've got seeds
Are
that I
you?
wanna start this week, and we've had some coming out.
Yeah,
And I tried to tell him that they reseeded, and he said, no, look at that plant. And big roots.
yeah.
They did stuff. So.
Any other questions, either in person or folks on Zoom? I think this has been really, really interesting.
You never tried the Vera? Because I know you grow that.
I plant that in the spring, like a summer annual.
You sell direct seed.
I do it in soil blocks. So I started inside, but I had some that self-sowed in the garden, and it was blooming with the larkspur. So I think that you can get it in earlier. Yeah.
All right, just to remind everybody, we do have another garden talk coming up in September. Our garden talks are the first Thursday of the month. So September, Pam Moore is following up with her monarch one from this winter. She's going to be talking about nectar plants for monarch butterflies as they start to migrate back to Mexico for the winter. So the registration is available on our website that Brandie has up there for us nicely. Thank you. And we will get this one, we'll get the recording up on YouTube and send it out to the folks who registered. If the folks here want a copy of the YouTube video, you can leave your email on our sign-in sheet and I'll add you to the list. So if there aren't any more questions, we'll end, and thanks, Brandie. This was awesome, and
Yeah, no problem.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
I'll see what you've done.